Alright everyone, so welcome to our first kind of lesson here in terms of content. So we're going to start with the Renaissance and also the Reformation. We'll get to the Reformation a little bit later on, but we're going to focus on the Renaissance here to start off the course this year. So our objectives and standards to explain how the Renaissance began in Italy and to recognize the key elements of the Renaissance. Excuse me. Take a moment there to read the standards, please. And our desired result is, how did the Renaissance begin? So that's the kind of main focus question I'm asking you to think about here as we go through the lesson, and we'll review that a little bit at the end of the lesson. But think about that question for our desired results. How did the Renaissance begin? So we have some vocabulary here. Renaissance. Renaissance means rebirth or a renewal of art and learning in terms of the time period. But the literal meaning is rebirth. And again, this is going to be a time of learning, art, language, studies, education, all these different things. And we'll talk about how that comes about a little bit. And then we have humanism. Humanism is an intellectual movement that focused on human achievements and potential, thinking that humans can do great things and are capable of great things. And that comes about during the Renaissance as well. Secular, this is concerned with worldly aspects and living in the present more so than religious elements. And we'll talk more about this as we go through the lesson here, but people during the Renaissance are going to live more secular lives than sacred lives. And we'll talk what that means and what that difference is. And then our last vocab word here is patrons. Patrons were people who supported the arts financially. And again, we'll talk more about them in a little bit. Alright, so before the Renaissance, so during the late Middle Ages, Europeans suffered in terms of war, disease, plague, all these horrible things that are going on, okay? And many are going to want to start to celebrate life and human spirit and be happy. They don't want to have to worry about war or disease or death or, taxes or different things like that. They want to start to, live their lives and be happy and and have some fun. So because of all this negativity, people are going to begin to question the institutions which were supposed to prevent them from suffering in war. Things like the king and the queen, things like the church, especially the church. People began to especially question the church because they were told that they had to endure suffering in order to receive rewards in heaven. So the church basically tells people, war, disease, these are all natural. We have to go through them in order to gain a place in heaven if you believe in, those types of things. So a lot of people, and people at the time believed in those things as well. So people begin to question the church because they're saying, well, I'm going through all these negative things in my life and I don't see anything getting better, and so, what's the point? So changes begin. In northern Italy, many writers and artists are going to begin to explore new styles. And this, again, is part of the Renaissance, and we'll take a look at this later on. But this new movement is going to last from around 1300 to about 1600. And we commonly call this time period the Renaissance, like we say, a time of rebirth, a time of learning, time of change in art and literature, all those different things. And men and women of this movement especially want to bring back the cultures of ancient Greece and Rome. So spreading the Renaissance. People of the Renaissance are also going to create something new that's going to spread to other parts of Europe. And we'll talk about how it spreads to other parts of Europe later on in the class, and the changes that happen around Europe and the world for that matter. But there are three elements in Italy that allow for the movement of ideas and culture and why the Renaissance begins here. Okay, first we have large city-states. City-states are these kind of like independent little areas inside a country. Italy wasn't a whole country at the time, so it's these kind of separate little kingdoms, if you will. And these large city-states in northern Italy, they have these urban centers, okay? So think of like Philadelphia or New York City today, and they're going to allow for exchanges in knowledge and ideas because people are gathering, they're trading, they're talking about different things they've seen in other city states. Hey, did you see this painting? Hey, did you try this new spice or this new food? And people go, no, I didn't try that. And then they say, oh, you should go there and try it. So people begin trying it and or seeing these pictures and artwork, and they talk about it, and that's how ideas spread, is by, talking about them. Excuse me. So with the exchange of these ideas, especially in places like Milan, Venice, Genoa, and Florence, you've probably heard of some of those places before. As people meet in these places and trade, they're going to expand the Renaissance to other areas. Another thing that impacted the Renaissance were patrons, and these were wealthy merchants and families, people like the Medicis, who were patrons, and they were supporters of the arts. What they did was they gave money to artists or writers or musicians to write or tell about, their families especially, but other things as well. But because of these wealthy people giving money to these artists and writers and musicians, we're going to see a birth of art and music and literature. And again, we'll talk more about that later on. And then the last part is classical Greece and Rome. People wanted to go back to way before the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages more so, and go back to the learning of the Greeks and the Romans. We'll see a lot of Greek and Roman architecture or people such as gods and goddesses in artwork. We'll see a lot of that kind of Greek and Roman style in artwork. A lot of music and writing focuses on that sometimes, or takes on some of that ancient Greek and Roman literature. So again, going back to a time when knowledge was powerful, and trying to bring that back to Europe as well. Now, different views. The study of classical Greece and Roman texts led to something called humanism. Now, humanists studied ancient values of the Greeks and applied them to the modern times, European times, Renaissance times. And they also applied a lot of these classical views to the art and to architecture as well. Humanists also studied history, literature, and philosophy, and these will become known as the humanities. So again, humanism, kind of looking at the potential of people and applying that to uh, the lives and culture of the Renaissance. Now, prior to the Renaissance, many people ate a lot of normal food. They wore very plain clothing, and a lot of people did this out of religious faith. They believed that if they were too vibrant in their clothing, or too fancy in eating their food, or eating fancy food, that they would not get into heaven. So they led very kind of, plain, simple lives. Didn't wear a lot of colors, didn't eat a lot of fancy food, didn't really, celebrate a lot. But again, during the Renaissance, people say, well, wait a minute, we can be enjoying life and still be worshiping God. We can still be religious, but we can still have a good time, and enjoy life. And a lot of people are going to begin to enjoy better clothing, food, music, and other luxuries, such as, fancy jewelry, or living in, nicer houses or castles, or whatever the case is. Again, this wasn't the case for everybody in the Renaissance. This was true for a lot of wealthier people or merchants. But again, people are going to kind of move away from a lot of the religious views. Now, people of the Renaissance were still religious, though. Again, they believed that humans should enjoy life on Earth now and worry about, the afterlife later on, or what happens to them after their lives, whatever their views were. And this was also very true for a lot of the church leaders, who were living lavish lifestyles, and they also supported the arts. Wealthy merchants, families, and church leaders are going to help support the arts by becoming patrons, like we said before, by giving money to these artists or musicians or writers. They're going to help the Renaissance continue to spread as well. But what about the people of the Renaissance? So men of the Renaissance. The writers of the Renaissance introduced the idea that educated people should create art. Now, the perfect man, or the ideal man, was supposed to be a master in every area of study. Writing, fighting, drawing, music. Supposed to be good at everything. And if a man excelled in every subject, he was known as a universal man, or later known as a Renaissance man. Now, according to Baldassare Castillon, in his book from 1528, The Courtier, a young man should be educated, witty, and charming. Young men should also sing, dance, write poetry, and play music. Like we said, they should be just kind of well-rounded all around. And they should be good at wrestling, riding horses, and swordsmanship, otherwise, fighting or fencing and things like that. So what about the women of the Renaissance? The courtier also discussed the role of women. So upper class women mainly were supposed to be charming and know the classics. Women were to inspire art, but they were rarely supposed to create it. However, women of the Renaissance were typically more educated than those of the Middle Ages, but still had very little power. But there were some women, like the woman you see there, Isabella d'Este, who did have power and expanded their role in politics and the arts. So here's an example of Renaissance men and women, obviously maybe a little more wealthier class here, but you can see the fancy clothing, obviously the long dress here, you can see the fancy hats as well. This guy has a sword here, so you can kind of see that as well. But again, this is some of the clothing styles. You can kind of see how people were moving away from some of the boring, kind of plain clothing of the Middle Ages to a more fancy, expressive style of clothing and of their lives. Okay, so closing out here. So think about, how did the Renaissance begin? What were some of the causes of the Renaissance? Why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? We talked about, the large city-states, the wealthy merchants, and also wealthy patrons, and also talking about wanting to go back to a time of ancient Greek and Roman culture and society. So think about those things, and that will help you answer your question. If you have any other thoughts or concerns, please let me know. And I hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I will hopefully talk to you all soon.